We fight. We argue. We debate. And we debacle. The online world is one of mixed signals and indeterminable intent. We're supposedly an evolved species, yet how do we expect future civilizations to understand us? What kind of Rosetta Stone will our descendants leave behind? What would that even look like? A short disclaimer about this episode, speaking of intent. There are a lot of problematics with discussing proper grammar, the least of which is the suggestion that we need another police to correct anyone. I'm a credentialed master's level teacher. English language arts is my primary core subject, but government, political science, civics, public speaking, those are the ones I can teach that I lean on more heavily in my daily life. And even though I don't teach in the classroom, I'm still kind of an English language nerd. I'm a writer. And even though I write mostly conversationally, I know the proper way to write something more formal. Now that's a lost art. Every classroom in America today is closing the technology gaps. Before long, school will be almost entirely online, and we'll have to find other ways to socialize our children. I know you're thinking, Josh, what about my job? I can't just go to work and leave my kid home alone. Don't worry, silly. Soon enough, you won't even have a job. Parents of almost every generation have struggled to understand their children's jargon and lingo. Heck, most kids don't even understand most of it in GL. We've cut down our context, TBH, leaving others to wonder if ILY or if I want you to FOAD. WTF are we even doing here? That's just crazy AF. But when we add emojis into the mix, America's playing a dangerous game of slang, broken language, and an unofficial hieroglyphics I fear hundreds of years down the road will make the lessons to learn of our time on this rock somewhat difficult to understand. This episode is about how America got online and how everything after changed, and we JDGAF. All we want is the next big thing, and we want it now, Daddy. But are we really taking the time to truly communicate with one another, ourselves, society as a whole? We're all saying a lot on social media these days. But what are we really saying? And when Facebook goes the way of MySpace, how much of your personal history will just magically poof, puff of smoke? Or if Facebook finally decides to delete anything over a decade old and you have to subscribe to keep them from purging anything older. God forbid, am I right? In this episode, it's all about how we communicate, how we share, how we learn, teach, and leave our ideas behind for future generations. So BRB, IGTG, and DW, I'll BRT, and if you'll STFU, I'll TLDR at ICYMI. AFAIK, I'm giving you a BTS at how we should have gone AFK, IYK, WIM. It's all confusing, IKR, but IDC, I'm tired of SMDH over this issue so many ROFL and LOL over. You may think I'm JK, but FWIW, I think it's FUBAR. RN, I'm going FTW. NVM, I'm going to FTW at TMI, y'all. BYOB or BOGO, if you were JW and TBF, IFTFY. We're all ISO answers, IRL. DAE have a FOMO? Well, IMHO, it doesn't matter, WYD. This is snafu, and I hate to say it, but I'm ABT to be LMAO as I drop my POV with little TLC and no TWW/E. Hey, don't turn away an MYOB. WYSIWYG here, folks, BC. IDK about you, but WYGAM, I want to know WDYT. So HMU, DM, IM, or PM me on FBIGLITT or any other SMB. If you think it's too much, just ask me to ELI5 it, just AMA, so you'll say TIL, whatever wasn't covered in your TOS. Okay. I'm OMW with some NSFW truths. You'll say TIA and I'll say NP. Look, you could DIY or LBGTFY ASAP. At the DOD, it's probably AKA and FAQ. Yeah, this one's about the really FKD up ways we all communicate. And welcome to the podcast, XO. Over the span of human existence, our communication has evolved from grunts to, well, grunts. Let's be honest. As primitive as our communication can be, let's not underestimate how calming and relaxing a good conversation is. I mean when you connect with someone, when you finish each other's sandwiches. That connection, relating to someone, with someone, knowing you aren't alone, that's the tie that binds us all. There's a beautiful thing about communication, though. It's a vast and diverse spectrum. We communicate in many ways, from physical, verbal, technological, and many more. The fact that humans can interact with one another just with our eyes speaks volumes. Communication is a full body, mind, and spirit exercise. That humans can communicate with creatures is even more incredible, don't you think? It doesn't always go our way, but that's not always our fault either, with humans or animals. I've discussed being nervous around dogs and bringing about a tense situation because the dog can't rationalize that you're scared of it. It just sees you acting antsy, and that nervousness or fear can come off as hostile to some animals, dangerous even. In the wild, that behavior might signify a predator ready to attack. The animal then just does what the animal instinctively does, whatever that might be. Body language, the energy we give off, and how we even carry ourselves tell our partners everything we need to know. In this episode, I'm using the term partner more in a sense that this other person with whom you're communicating is your partner in this improv exercise of interpersonal communication. Rarely do we get today's script ahead of time, so we're all just winging it, aren't we? Yeah, don't tell me you're not an actor or you can't do improv. If you can talk to a stranger, you're acting. We're always putting on a show for someone, aren't we? Maybe even just ourselves. When we're engaged in a conversation of any kind, the person or people with whom we are communicating are our communication partners. They don't even have to be humans, as we've learned. There are many effective ways to communicate. There are techniques that will help you bring out the most in your partner, putting them at ease, and, of course, being a receptive partner to their message as well. That we aren't just waiting to talk, we're listening. Sometimes I think we all feel this way. It seems like many are just waiting for a pause there to insert their thought without considering what you just said. As in, most of us don't process new information immediately or on the fly. For most people of even above average intelligence, there's a delay, a few seconds, a pause, a beat. Sometimes it takes minutes before our brains piece everything together. In those cases, we feel silly expressing ourselves in the conversation because we feel like we're taking it off a point from where it is now to go back to where it was a few minutes ago when we had our stroke of brilliant thought. The decision on whether to speak up at all can fill many with anxiety. Think of how much anxiety we feel around communicating with even our closest loved ones, your most trusted friends and family. It's stressful when your partner is someone you know. Strangers can be terrifying. Now, let's discuss the idea of academic confidence. Then later on, we'll examine this through the lens of that perspective. In previous episodes, I've addressed this idea before. It's something I learned about going through grad school. Learning about the stages of human development, learning styles, learning challenges, and this idea of academic confidence was transformative. For me, it was a lifelong validation fulfilled. I'd always felt like I struggled in school because I wasn't enough. I wasn't smart enough, disciplined enough, or something. Then I realized that what we know today about education and learning, psychologically speaking, is exponentially beyond what we knew or accepted 20, 30, 40 years ago. That much of that is mental health, psychological, and research-driven education philosophy. Academic confidence, in a nutshell, is the idea that if you feel like you're good at something, you'll improve at that thing more than if you feel like you're struggling with it. It isn't lying or even passing a student who hasn't achieved those benchmarks. The idea is altering the environment, learning experience, and most importantly, attitudes and language from a traditional pass-fail dynamic to one that not only focuses on the individual learning styles of the student, but also factors the whole child into the equation. What do we mean when we say whole child? The child isn't just a random number in an assigned seat. The child isn't braided ponytail, red glasses, braces, but has a name in the attendance system, a preferred name they're comfortable being called, and a story. That story makes up the whole child. A child who misses breakfast every morning. A child who stays on campus until almost 5 because they don't have a ride. The child who's tormented by the bully. The kid who seems to have it all. These children all have different experiences which dictate how they learn and communicate. So in any given case, what we know of basic human and even child psychology is that we don't differ that much from animals in this regard. We do good. We want tummy rubs and scratches behind the ear, at least. We do real good. We want a treat. Treats make us do real good again and again and again. Then eventually you don't even have to give us treats. We just drool every time the bell rings. But just like animals in this regard, we don't do good. We certainly don't want to be kicked, admonished, or publicly humiliated. That might drive some to do better, but it drives most to self-harm in one form or another. Friends, most of us can't show ourselves the compassion to communicate this idea within our own brains. This idea that we struggled and that we struggled likely because of the environments and those entrusted to lead us let us down. And that was either by personal limitations or the limitations of a bigger establishment, but that we know that and can identify that means we must begin changing that today and not the next election cycle. Those who know must seize the narrative from those who don't understand these struggles I've just mentioned. Because just in case you didn't think it related to the overall topic here, how we learn is how we communicate. How we communicate is how we learn, and moreover, how we communicate is how future generations and civilizations will understand what we've learned. Many will criticize Common Core without understanding what that even is. Many might dismiss alternative learning methods without an understanding of the science behind it. Many will criticize the institution, learning environment, educator, or even the student before they will pursue an understanding of learning methods and the stages of human development. Many who criticize education have no idea what academic confidence even is, much less how that affected their own learning experience. Many will communicate very negative things publicly without the beginnings of the required knowledge on the subject matter. And they will defend that point to almost any ends. We see that demonstrated repeatedly with every interaction on social media, unless we've all but bleached it from our algorithm. Communication and miscommunication, ideas interrupted, points mistaken, and belligerent belittlings. All in all, it gets lost in Txtlation. How often have we seen an interaction go south simply because the words expressed and the intended weren't received in the same manner in which they were, intended? Lost in Txtlation. When all you have is the written, typed, or even in the moment spoken word for anyone to misinterpret however their unresolved trauma chooses. Those words where we have left something behind for someone else to stumble on sometime within forever and read in context, out of context, however it happens, we aren't there to explain or expound. We can't further defend that point, clarify, or redirect. We simply leave our mark and move along, satisfied that we've proven our point. But what point did we really prove? It's the instantaneous brain juice gratification of winning without regard for the long-term consequences. We've tagged that post with our graffiti, and there's no turpentine to wash that off. It's just there. That's just those hot debate topics on social media. I brought it around to education because we see a lot of criticisms on education and some individuals' information processing potential. I bring up academic confidence because we see so many today who lacked that in school, and that embarrassment or humiliation trauma turned them off to learning. So today, they have no idea how to learn or dissect new information to determine how it applies to them. They just get an opinion from someone they respect more than themselves, or somewhere they feel is superior to the truth. They aren't trained in scrutinizing truth, and they know it. And because of that low academic confidence, even as adults, long after their student days ended, that low academic confidence manifests itself in similar ways to other forms of low self-esteem and low confidence. Some humble themselves to what they don't know and seek to know. And if they aren't capable of that, they rely on respected and research-driven sources of information to supplement that information gap. Some simply know not humility and stand proud and tall as a self-proclaimed expert and feel like they should have just as much of a platform as anybody else. Because they never did the work, weren't capable of doing the work, or didn't have as much of an opportunity to have the chance to do the work, they criticize those who have, who do, and who can. It's an insecurity of the ugly, out-of-shape, toxic masculinity bro at the bar calling a woman an ugly slut because she politely turns him down. We're not willing to be the kind of man a woman like her would even settle for, so he tears her down to feel better about his own insufficiencies, shortcomings, and areas in which he could improve. That would likely improve his life all the way around, not just with the ladies. Nah, we don't like change, do we? The issue is, our society has somehow managed to provide that bro with a soapbox and a megaphone to spew his toxic ideas about relationships, sex, dating, and all of that into the void, and worse yet, with no regard for consequences. Allow that message to amass an audience with no context or stipulation that, hey, this type of talk and attitude is why women won't go for you. It's not how you look, it's how you are. Sometimes. Many times, but you get my drift. We see people criticizing public education while voting to strip its funding further. It's those barely lit candles flickering in the darkness, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and every other cliche about the vocal minority seizing the narrative, and those who allowed it to happen. When it comes to communication, we've allowed the gaslighting of our social platforms to go from everyone is entitled to an opinion to everyone's opinion matters to free speech means everyone's entitled to share their opinion whenever and wherever they like, even on your platform. It's no wonder we're constantly at each other's throats behind our keyboards and screens. As we'll discuss more later in this episode, there's a greater warning than just the language we use and how we treat each other. There's the consequence of future generations trying to make sense in translating the garbled nonsense we risk when language and communication evolve more individually and within smaller social or cultural groups than it does on a larger scale. When these groups, individuals, us, begin compromising the rules of language for the sake of breaking rules and making things easier, it risks language and communication devolving, all for the sake of just not following along and challenging the status quo. Language and communication have evolved since the dawn of humankind. Challenging the status quo is how that happens. However, when challenging the status quo, we must have a plan for the future and ideas in place to accommodate for everyone. When more respect is given to slang, slurs, and slurred speech than clear communication, we aren't making our own rules. We're dictating how those in the future will understand us or misunderstand us. In translating early texts from hundreds of thousands of years ago, experts have to study a great deal of nuance about a society or civilization to understand what they were saying while they were saying whatever we found they said, however we found they said it. Intent. Intent is the nuance lost over time. Intent is usually unraveled through sociology, anthropology, or some other ology. Discerning that nuance becomes harder when characters are illegible and indistinguishable. The story is told through pictures more than language. And when more and more and more is left to interpretation. Didn't we see how that worked out with religious texts? That's why finding clear ways to be clear in our communication with respect and regard to our socio-cultural realities must be essential, especially in the age of the internet and social media. One day, all this technology might fail. One day, every idea, memory, picture, video, and every bit of brilliance you've ever shared will be disabled, deleted, or made completely inaccessible due to disaster. One day, all of this texting and chatting and all the ways we communicate our stories might just disappear into the void of nothingness. Then what? Forget the undeniable, indeterminable intent of our modern hieroglyphics, the emoji. From shorthand to text shorthand to emojis, we run the risk of miscommunicating more than clearly communicating the intent of our point. We fall into the comfort, laziness, or security of our social circles, where inside jokes, being trendy, saying the thing without saying the thing, becomes the norm. When "pass me a fork" generates a huge chuckle fest for the 3 people who experienced it, but everyone else is left out of the joke altogether, which isn't as dangerous as it is rude. But it is concerning when we communicate in this way on a much larger scale. We stop seeing our audience as our communication partners, and we feel like they're just going to stick around for the ride, whatever we say, and you'll get it later. In the modern era, we would all be served moving forward with a crash course in effective communication and active listening techniques. For social media specifically, so that we can all share a story that will last lifetimes beyond our own. And we must get back to documenting our lives and ideas beyond our thumbs. Cancel cursive all you want, but make manuscript mandatory. If not, from slang and slurs to social bubble semantics, in this day and age, we're all running the risk of being lost in Txtlation. Judge me if you'd like, but I wasn't always proud of my dad growing up. Despite my environment, I valued being smart early in life, even if I didn't always appreciate the work it took to be smart. Even if I didn't learn until much later, it wasn't as much about biology as it was learning styles, challenges, trauma, and environment. I can't exactly pinpoint the thing or the moment in life that made me want to be smarter than everyone around me or led me to believe that was even possible, or even when I realized they weren't all that smart to begin with. It just was. Granted, being better didn't come until much later, but smarter mattered to me. People who said wrong things and presented them as if they were right got under my skin. This isn't to say that I am, or even that I think I'm smart, or the smartest person in the room or the world. No one knows how little I know more than I. This desire to know has been one of my driving forces in life. My goal wasn't always to be the smartest guy in the room. Mine was to not be the dumbest person in the room, or even in the bottom half. If I couldn't be the smartest person in the room, I at least wanted to be the person in the room who was smart enough to shut up and listen to the smartest person in the room. Surrounded by Beverly Hillbillies, Southern stereotypes of mush-mouth drawls and misspoken and misunderstood colloquialisms, tasteless humor at the expense of others, and what I now have come to realize was a blatant disregard for some humans while living with this outward illusion of y'all come back now and you hear justified on Sunday mornings. I was numbed to the atrocities before me as normalized and accepted behavior, whether those atrocities were offensive jokes aimed at marginalized groups or the absolute butchering of the English language. How easy would it have been for me to just not open my mouth when I speak to enunciate my words? Give no thought or filter to the thoughts that erupted from my brain and show frivolous disregard for the English language. Blame it on my dad's unabashedly unintellectual personality and to the bookshelf in my childhood homes. My trusty old Funkin' Wagnall's Standard Encyclopedia Dictionary. That was my toilet reading material. Maybe if I stuck with shampoo bottles and hairspray bottles, I'd have been more science-driven. I'd be rich. This book, though, had so much information. I was addicted to this book. I'd read words and definitions, some stuck. I would read about currency and insurance and United Nations, the founding documents of our nation, mythology, etymology, and so much more. I was a little sponge. Then we had the entire set of Encyclopedia Britannica with A to Antwerp and ended with Zydeco or whatever, who remembers, but I would read those books over and over. My father, who would espouse to be a smart man, might have been the smartest man in the room often. He just wasn't a man of very diverse rooms or very diverse areas. In the safe and comfy confines of the small minds in the small towns, my dad could engage and communicate and discuss or even debate/argue. But deeply learned is not something I would say my dad was. Jack of all trades, master of none. Except that my dad believed he was the master of some, when in fact he had no track record or gravitas to back that idea up. My dad could do a lot of things. More things maybe than I can today. But I can do a lot more things than he ever dreamt of. Different things. In fact, if my dad were alive today, I'd be calling him a lot to come help me fix things around this house that I pay other people to fix now because I was always too good to learn how to do labor-like tasks. How's that for a sneak peek into the real me? That's just what it was. I didn't like doing the things. I never look down on anyone who does work things like that. That's not it. It's not that I'm better than someone who does that. It's not that mentality. It's an I hate doing this so much it makes me hate living life itself mentality. It isn't to say I've never done the things. It's that I have and choose a life where I don't have to repair things like that anymore. Like most of anyone else, I enjoyed the things that challenged me in the ways I enjoyed being challenged, but not in the ways I was bored with or that seemed more work than payoff. I never cared about engines or woodworking or electrical or any of that. I enjoy knowing about it, knowing how it works, without knowing how to do it. How to do it takes work, practice, and patience. Those aren't things I've ever been interested in unless I was. If I'm being honest, a lot of things come very naturally to me. It's easy. Other things aren't. It just so happens that those things that I don't like doing, those things that don't interest me, those things I could do but I'm not altogether passionate about, or I altogether loathe, are the things I truly abhor about this world. I'm certain within a relatively short time I could learn how to masterfully sculpt a lawn with those little back and forth crisscross lines and whatever. I simply don't care about it and I hate mowing lawns. So today, if my yard guy quit and my wife said, "Here's a push mower," I'd say, "Here's my lawyer's number." I couldn't mow this yard today. It takes me hours. It'd be miserable on a riding mower. I'd be exhausted after an hour and trimming would be another day. Part of that is I don't train for that kind of work, but mostly my body hurts and I've lived life like a stuntman without a camera in front of me. Now, knowing how I feel about outside and outside chores, why would I go around pretending that I can mow yards like a professional landscaper? I might fool some folks. I might impress someone until I have to put up or shut up, and that may never happen. Like what's going to happen? I'm going to be at a cookout in the neighborhood and somebody says, "Oh yeah, well, we're going to have a mow-off, winner take all." So what I say is, I think with a relatively short period of time, I could probably mow a yard in a way that's close enough to the way my experienced landscaper does to justify saving that $40 every 2 weeks to 10 days for several months out of the year. Instead of boasting and bragging about how I could do something I don't spend near enough time practicing, I recognize that my landscaper is special for being able to do what he does because my body wouldn't hold up to it after all it's been through up to this point. There's a slope and it's just all fairly easy, just incredibly unlevel. I came to learn that while I admired my dad for his diversity of knowledge, I also was able to recognize that there was a difference in amateur and expertise in all things, even my dad's varied subject matters. My dad was an amateur at a lot and an expert at very little. In his boasting and bragging, I'm not sure he differentiated. In fact, he may never have had to. If you're never challenged and you surround yourself with people who need you to do the things, it doesn't matter if you're doing them right, well, or whatever. Until someone shows up to say, "Who did this? Your house is going to burn down." Physical work wasn't for me. Trade skills, labor, those things, being dirty, outside, uncomfortable, those things didn't drive me. Those were the things I worked to avoid, while appreciating and respecting anyone who can do that work that I can't do. I really want to be clear on this. This is me not liking doing things my dad did, which leads me into the topic of how we communicate. But I'm not someone who looks at someone with a tool and says, "Ew." I'm someone who looks at them as special for doing something I find so unappealing. There is respect there, even for the task itself. I just don't want to do it. Doing those things often hurt. I wasn't lazy by any means, but I was biologically geared toward the path of least resistance. While I didn't want a life of labor, coming home dirty every day, calloused hands, exhausted, I admire people who can do that work. Somehow, I was a problem solver like my dad, but a deeper thinker and maybe more open to change. I went to my dad's high school in my dad's hometown. We moved around before that, but something was different from our paths. I never really considered my father to be unintelligent or dumb. He just wasn't learned. He didn't focus on reading unless it was for his religion, which I believe was a refuge to keep from accepting some of his toxicities, or for success, for money. He had all the self-help entrepreneur books like Think and Grow Rich, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And while he probably wouldn't have listed communication as a focus in his life, it was a cornerstone of Daddy's professional and personal life. I got a degree in it, so it's easy for me to spot. He was just like we all do, communicating poorly. He couldn't spell, his handwriting was atrocious, his cursive was illegible, and his manuscript was mostly all caps. He'd write notes for me to take to school, and I would make him rewrite them to correct the spelling. "I'm not taking this to them, Dad." "Why not?" "Because you misspelled this word. And it's there, not there." My dad did not like feeling stupid, nor did I like making him feel that way. I just lacked sufficient social skills to condescend or pander to his ego. While we were the best of friends, most of the time, me and my father clashed. And I know right now I come off a little... I know how I come off. I just can't help it. I'm trying to be authentic with you. My father's shortcomings in the literal arts made me want to rise above and not misspell words or... Oh God, Dad had this thing with epithets. He'd get them just wrong, like, hindsight's 50-50. And the thing is, I just don't think he did it ironically. I do a lot of things like that ironically to annoy certain people. It's fun. Dad just wasn't that suave with his comedy. Dad's comedy was more Three Stooges and a frying pan rattling the frontal lobe. Dad also wasn't a great teacher of comedy. When I went for the easy laughs in the supermarket as a kid, we were in the baking aisle. So I found a skillet, an actual skillet in the bakeware, and shouted to my dad down the way, "Hey, Dad!" And when he turned around to give me the attention I so desperately craved, I smiled my big goofy smile and said, "Watch!" and then whapped myself upside the forehead with a frying pan. I believe that to have been my first concussion. Dad could have rushed to my side and communicated effectively. "Are you okay? What were you thinking? Why would you do that?" To which I might have replied, once I was able to cogently form thoughts, "No, my head is killing me and these lights are blinding. I have no idea, but I thought it would be funny. And we watched the Three Stooges and they did it and you laughed until you shat yourself." My dad didn't get for entertainment purposes only. It would be years later, once I got into acting myself, that I realized props aren't real. In fact, most of those items in those old slapstick shows were foam or rubber. Still today, there isn't a lot of contact to the actor, even from the softer foes. It's all camera trickery and angles. In all the ways my dad could have communicated concern, he did so with a hearty snicker and, "Get your ass up off the floor, who knows when it was cleaned last?" And in pure Red Formian style, he threw out a good old-fashioned dumbass for me. Or some other name he liked to call me back then. There were many. Terms of endearment, I used to regard them. Until I grew up and realized I chose people to be close to me who would continue that kind of abuse. My dad was mean to me. I was mean back. We called that love. I discussed that abuse cycle in the previous series, You Give Love a Bad Name, where I laid out how television sitcoms have gaslit us into believing we can be mean and bully the people we love. It's altered our love languages. Pop culture alters our language, period. To blend these points, I'll say that my dad left behind communication which wasn't all that effective in telling his story, his real story. The same with his mother, my granny. Most of her ideas and writings I have are transcribed Bible passages in very difficult to read cursive, which we will discuss more in a bit. It's that these two wonderful people from my past died and left behind nothing of substance as a written word legacy or story. Lots of illegible scribblings on the back of ancient photographs adhered to photo albums and notes here and there. This is how we communicate through generations as well. So many families. And those stories are lost or relegated to social media posts over the last couple of decades and subject to disappearing with no notice. Circling back to this culture of cultism I'm deconstructing, and the toxic white Southern culture specifically, this is one of the prideful ignorance I've discussed before, where it's not just enough to not know and not care to know, but to be proud and bragging about not knowing and then belittling knowing. This isn't just in politics or social issues. This is about pride and learning challenges and academic confidence. It's generations of people who were poorly served by their educational institutions, who should have recognized their struggles rather than just ignoring them or mishandling them, mislabeling them as stupid, slow class, whatever, not leaving them behind. Rather than glorifying and blindly accepting my father's limitations, I insisted he at least sit and learn something while writing my field trip permission note. Had I known then what I know now of those learning and environmental challenges he might have faced, maybe I'd have been more compassionate and less snarky. But just letting him look bad wasn't going to happen on my watch. I know how people look at others when they bring an idea to the table and it's littered with spelling and grammar errors. There isn't a lot of, hey, this person may have skated through life with no one correcting them, and they might have a learning disability at that. It's just a lot of pushing that idea aside, regardless of its merit, in favor of those ideas that are well put together and well communicated. In our society, I believe we're showing more regard for dismissiveness and not causing a conflict than insisting on standards of effective communication. However, somewhere between fuck your feelings and my compassion and critical thinking workbook, there's a middle ground of finding ways to help others communicate more effectively without being condescending jerks about it all the time. Sometimes that's hard, especially when they're the personality like my dad was. An expert at everything, they think they know because they think they can without doing any of the work to know. That prideful ignorance where they're proud to not know has taken our language, American English, and turned it into a second language. Not so much from a foreign language standpoint, but secondary to a multilingual pop culture melting pot version of American geocultural slang and dialect. I've had the debate many times over the phrase proper grammar. There are a lot of problematic implications thanks to those bad people who say and think bad things about other people. I'd like to explore that in just a bit without lending any credence to any of the small-minded nonsense. I've always been an English nerd. I've enjoyed writing papers. I just usually opposed the assignments. I would have loved a more modern learning atmosphere back then, one where I could have had more of a choice in, well, anything. But I was condemned to small town, small mind, rural Southern America. Suffice to say, every experience left a lot to be desired. Just like I've discussed with my dad, my frustration grew the more I was around people who were incorrect and just didn't care. Yeah, I was that guy. And yes, I know Brainy Smurf always got tossed out of the village on his head, glasses slightly askew, every episode. But this is just who I am. We're allowing our language, the primary means through which this culture and civilization communicates, to become fragmented, segmented, and, I fear, uninterpretable for future generations. What was Grandnana trying to say here, Mama? Oh, thumbs up, bullseye, poo goat, 100%, pizza slice, ghost, skull, and crossbones. Who knows, sweetheart, but she sure did love you. While there are many different ways we communicate, let's be honest. There are really only two types of communication: effective and ineffective. There are many effective means of communication we've discussed: body language, facial expressions, and the various form of verbal, written, and otherwise technologically transmitted means, just to name a few basics. It's the specific use of those and the reliance on them that can become problematic. And of course, the intent behind the communication. There are many ineffective methods of communication. Today, we see a lot of that on social media. Social media. That really changed the game for how we communicate. Internet dating changed how we intimately interact. Email eliminated inescapable meetings. Texting meant no longer getting random calls out of the blue with no context. Initialism, text shorthand, SMS language, and emojis eliminated the need for words and spelling altogether. There we are. Modern day hieroglyphics. We communicate in many ways, and the ways we communicate change over time. How we translate that communication might change as well. In fact, it might be that we translate or process that communication much differently years later than it was originally intended. Just like my dad's harmless teasing that I once saw as a sign that he liked me and now I see as cyclical generational abuse that caused trauma, it is essential that we get it right the first time around. With parenting, with writing, period. Communication is important to a civilization. My argument on proper grammar isn't a knock against other cultures or the assimilation of other languages, styles, or cultures into the English language. Hell, it's even with the acknowledgement of how oppressive American English can be, how difficult it is to learn, and how problematic the origins of our language may be. Still, it's the language we've got, ain't it? Mine is a statement to whatever American English culture is, that we ensure it is preserved. Not that we're proud of that culture, because some of that culture simply should not be allowed. Some of the words and phrases need re-examination or exclusion altogether to moving forward. As for how humanity will interpret us in hundreds or thousands of years, we need to make sure we embrace the assimilation of other cultures and language, appreciating the melting pot, while also ensuring that the base of our language doesn't fall prey to slang, slurs, or symbols, and that we don't entirely rely on technology. The written word has lasted for thousands of years. Digital dies when the server does. Again, we don't live in a world of absolutes, and I'm sure this may come across to some as a cry to preserve white culture. Trust me, that ain't it. It's that the language does and will evolve, as it has. Just go back to those founding documents in my old Funkin' Wagnalls, and you'll see we just don't talk like that anymore. And one day we won't talk like this anymore either. But what we leave behind for future generations needs to be reflective of how we do communicate, so that they can understand us better. And before anyone gets trigger happy on the old cancel culture button, allow me to expound on this. We hear a great deal about cultural appropriation today. To help put a finer point on this, this ain't about white people disclaimer I'm putting out, let's discuss the differences in cultural appropriation, cultural assimilation, and cultural exploitation, where communication is concerned. Cultural appropriation in language is just as it is in any other form. Someone like me wearing cultural garb that isn't of my heritage can be problematic. Similar with how we communicate. So when we see our friends, without consideration for if anyone is of a Spanish language heritage, we wave and say, "Hola, mi amigo. Sayonara, muchachos. Time to go have a pint at the pub and enjoy that good old schadenfreude when somebody slips off their stool and busts their keister." We say these cliche things without thinking that in that sentence I either paid homage or poked fun at Asian, Latin, English, Irish, Scottish, and German heritage. That's where we get into the appropriation or assimilation. What's the difference? Appropriation is defined as taking on the characteristics of another culture that is not your own in an inappropriate manner. So the majority group sort of cherry-picking the cool things about the culture of a minority group and taking it over. The Britannica definition goes on to specify that cultural appropriation is doing this as a joke. That's the big difference. Cultural assimilation might be a very similar definition, without the word inappropriate and the as a joke intent. When a culture embraces or adopts the characteristics of another culture but does so in earnest, they are assimilating into each other's culture. It's a back and forth, mutual exchange. We don't see that as much, do we? Even Cinco de Mayo in America is celebrated by more than just the Latin communities, but also exploited for capitalism by pretty much everyone. Cultural exploitation is cultural appropriation on meth. If the intent in assimilation is genuine and the intent with appropriation is joking, then exploitation, if you need any further explanation than that, is mean-spirited, hateful, bigoted, and meant to either oppress or, worse yet, profit from those differences. It isn't to say that cultural appropriation is harmless because we have exploitation, which is way worse. It's to say that there are subtle differences with intent. Even assimilation isn't always altruistic. Knowing how to differentiate the intent helps us understand appropriate crossings of our cultures. For example, a white family who makes it a point to learn about other cultures might decide that one day a month they explore a new, different cuisine. They study American history and find that they love soul food, so they make one night a month soul food night. When that's enjoyed respectfully, without making the other culture all about them, it's assimilating some African American culture, even if it's just cuisine, into their white culture. Cultural appropriation would be if that family thought the dress, accents, mannerisms, or other aspects of that culture they saw at the restaurant or on TV were cool, and so they started embodying some of those traits, characteristics, customs, or culture in their daily lives, almost posing or pretending to be this billboard of open-minded diversity. The best way I can think of to hammer this point home is to describe it as a phase. You know how some people sort of adjust their personalities sometimes? When you pick something up from another culture just because it's cool to you or to others or popular, and it's just a phase. Hey Dad, remember when we all walked around wearing dashikis that one summer? And everyone laughs at how silly that was. Cultural appropriation. Cultural exploitation takes that to a whole other level and causes significantly more harm to the group it's victimizing. Imagine if that family, who enjoyed soul food once a month, decided to one-man gang their family into a bunch of African dreams and open a soul food restaurant in suburbia, taking the title of Best Soul Food from someone actually from that community who may not have the same path of opportunity as this well-to-do family who can go out to eat in this economy. In case you didn't get the George Gray reference, let's step back into the squared circle of professional wrestling for a moment. Another more real example of cultural exploitation would be the WWE's very white one-man gang changing characters to acknowledge his deepest, darkest Africa roots. That actually happened on television in the late 1980s. The African Dream, Akeem, who was born white in Southern California, donned a dashiki and headdress and had a very, very stereotypical manager named Slick. His debut featured him in the inner city projects surrounded by actors playing Africans. I know. How much more exploitive can you get with cultural exploitation? He did it in blackface. The WWE did that with other wrestlers. Don't worry. They even suggested one wrestler, Ahmed Johnson, that they hang him from a rope in a storyline. When he refused because he didn't like the idea of young black children seeing that normalized in any form, he was ousted, labeled as difficult and dangerous to work with. Whether it was true or not, the fact is that Ahmed Johnson wasn't a great in-ring wrestler. However, he fit into Vince McMahon's buff bodybuilder kink. And when he wouldn't lower himself to racial stereotypes for Master McMahon's entertainment purposes only, Ahmed Johnson was essentially blackballed from professional wrestling. Johnson may have been whatever as a wrestler, but it's another example of another rich white man ... What Ahmed Johnson and others not in that writer's room knew was that the message communicated by that imagery would not just be isolated to the television storyline or the wrestling ring. The difference between assimilation, appropriation, and exploitation is a thin line. In fact, it's more and more difficult to read at times while also being so very ethically clear at others. This is what causes so much confusion, discomfort, and outrage. In the English language, we tend to gloss over the distinctions of those ideas. But I would like to shift our thinking of these three words from cultural to communication. Communication assimilation might be offering translation services for those who struggle with English as a second or third language, like we might for the hearing or visually impaired. We might recognize that in another country or culture, red, yellow, green for stop signals might not be what they use. So in warnings in that language on the chart, the background might need to be purple or whatever color the culture recognizes as a warning. Communication appropriation might be that hola mi amigo and sayonara taco Tuesday Cinco de Mayo kind of recognition of a communicative cultural difference for a limited time only. We aren't altogether embracing culture, but we're picking and choosing the parts that are easy for us to consume. Day of the Dead? No way, Jose. That's too weird with all the face paint and skeletons. We already have Halloween, so we'll just do the one with more margaritas. No concern for learning what any of that is about, just using it for fun. Communication exploitation. Well, sure, that can dip into those Cinco de Mayo specials being advertised for profit with no acknowledgement or tribute paid to the origin of the money-making idea. However, let's look at this level of exploitation more like, God, this is awkward. When someone of one group tries too hard to sound like someone from another group. Like I've mentioned before, I'm a voice actor capable of communication in many different forms, including accents. Many I should never do, because it's exploitive. I'd be imitating someone or a generalized imitation of a group. I would be altering my voice to sound in stereotypical ways, even if I might be bullseye accurate. It's not my place to even try to be accurate with most accents. Stay in your lane, as they say. When Yo MTV Raps debuted in the 1980s, Hip-hop culture and the slang, slurs, and style in which that culture spoke spread like wildfire to impressionable kids desperate to be accepted socially. White kids. Many, many white kids. Now, to me, some of the best accents are the hybrids. I heard a Frenchman who lived in the southern U.S. for years, and that was a hoot. It was almost Creole, but more country. In this case, just as with any other, communication naturally blends when you come from one culture into another culture. That happens. I know a woman who wasn't Scottish at all when we met, but her husband was. When they moved to America, had a family, then decided to move back to Scotland, I see her post on social media now and she's full on Scot. With my abilities, I could naturally transition my communication style to many places throughout Europe without much struggle while learning the native dialect. There isn't anything exploitive or appropriative about this, as I see it, because that's a natural and genuine practical intent. You're not pretending to be German. You've lived in Germany for almost a decade and your native Chicago accent has been influenced by the constant German you're hearing. I would quickly lose most of my southern twang if I lived somewhere else for a very long time. We aren't trying to do it. It's survival instinct. We don't want to stick out and be that person who's different. So we assimilate. We embrace change and commit to it. Intent. That's the difficult X factor in all this. That's where it gets lost in Txtlation. Jamie Foxx posted something on social media that actor Jennifer Aniston took as anti-Semitic. This caused a social media uproar for approximately 27 hours before something else happened to distract everyone. This is just one example, but a shining one of the episode title, Lost in Txtlation. Today, our communication has become so complicated and convoluted that we stress out with anxiety trying to translate and interpret someone's every intent. They roll their eyes, are they disinterested, dismissive, or simply struggling with an eyelash? If I sigh loudly, my wife will ask me what's wrong. Nothing. I'm old. I hurt. I'm tired. If we leave someone unopened, then are we mad at you? Or did I just reply, set my phone down, move on to my next ADHD distraction, and not see your reply before my screensaver went black? We communicate through grunts and hand gestures, abbreviations, initialism, and the most difficult to understand method of communication, passive-aggressive. There's simply so much we can say without even saying it. We must pay more attention to what we say, how we say it, with respect to the multiple ways it could be heard. It isn't so much to not mean any harm. We must strive to not cause any harm. When it comes to the legacy we leave behind, let's hope we can embrace cultural assimilation as a bastion, a lighthouse of accepting and incorporating diversity into our culture without leaving a stain of mockery and exploitation for future generations to be ashamed of, the way we are of our grandparents and the photos they might be in from the mid to early 20th century. History was written by the victors for 2,000 years. Then, the internet came. Today, we all write history. Our own. Our families, our cultures, our peoples, our worlds. I'm not so sure we take the gravity of our instant gratification culture seriously enough. We swing at the low-hanging fruit, seeking the path of least intellectual resistance, while falling prey to the dumbing down and numbing down of society. I'm not saying if you type out LOL or if you're Gen Z and think IJBOL is the move, that you're this, that, or anything in particular. I'm saying that each one of us needs to consider more the long-lasting impact of what we say. Because one day might simply be BC. Does that matter to you? It should. Because the rules of our language are such that C doesn't equal cause. While we might understand that shorthand, how many generations go by before that nuance is lost? You see, this isn't just about one word, or texting, emojis, slang, slurs, and styles of speaking, TBH. This is the history of our peoples. I asked at the front, I'll repeat now. What kind of Rosetta Stone will we leave behind for civilizations 1,000 years from now to discern what we've learned? When the flimsy commercialized capitalism-grade paperbacks are rotted away into dust and the digital records are wiped by disaster, when all the videos, snaps, instas, feeds, stories, talks, and shorts are gone, said, done, deleted, when every memory is simply somewhere in a cloud, locked away with a multi-step security protocol only you knew hundreds of years ago, when every word and idea we've had is reduced to ones and zeros before becoming no more, what will we leave behind? How will we communicate with the future if we can't even figure out how we communicate in the now? Coming up, probably the one episode of this season I'll have to mark explicit content with an explicit warning label. For the next one, 18 and up, please. Winky face emoji. I may let a colorful profanity slide in my general content, but mostly for emphatic purposes, more than just being crass. I put tacky shock jock on the shelf a long time ago, but I still like to cuss, a lot. I sprinkle the F word on my vernacular like an Olive Garden waiter with a cheese grater. I'm unapologetic about it. If you can't handle a simple word, you're the one who needs to grow up, pal, not me. If you can't look at your kid and say, hey, you can't say that word, he's a jerk for even saying it, that's on you as a parent. I'm about real-world life lessons and authenticity, and this next episode is all about the words you say we shouldn't say. In Bleeped Out, it's all about the bleeping words we bleep out and why they're so bleeping fun to say. But we're also going to dig into the history of some of those words to find out what the actual bleep is up with them to begin with. The idea of profane words over profane intent is one that's intrigued me for most of my life. When it came to popping off some profanities, I learned from the professor. My pop, he could cuss like a sailor. It was an art form for Daddy. Let's head back to college for Art History 101 and discuss what the bleeping bleep is the next bleeping episode about anyway. Slurs, slang, the 7 dirty words you can't say on television, and more. Exposed. As I'm deconstructing a culture of cultism. Thanks for joining me. My book, Overthinking Everything About You, is available on Amazon, and you can link to it through joshbrandonmedia.com. You can find my music on my website. Check out some of my other videos on YouTube. You'll find all my original music in a playlist, all my TikToks, all of Overthinking Everything, clips of my acting, voiceover work. It's all organized in playlists for your convenience. Check out my merch store and get your trigger tees in the Sure Talks a Lot, Swags a Lot store. More products coming soon. Follow me on TikTok and everywhere online. Like, share, and subscribe to this video and this channel. Do all the things I need you to do to help me grow. You'll grow with me. If you like this series, consider a donation to Cash App. And don't forget to sign up for my email list. I'm Josh Brandon, and I'm overthinking everything.